The next item on the order paper is Council and Commission statements on the conclusions of the European Council meeting of 15th of October 2015, in particular the financing of international funds, and of the leaders' meeting on the Western Balkans route of 25th of October 2015 and preparation of the Valletta summit of 11th and 12th November 2015. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, on Sunday, as President of this House, invited by Commission President Juncker, I took part in the leaders' meeting on the Western Balkans route, which took place in Brussels. As I explained to the Conference of Presidents on Thursday, given the dramatic situation, I think it is quite right that Commission President Juncker invited everyone concerned to Brussels to agree on practical operational measures. President Tusk and myself accepted the invitation and took part in this meeting. Irrespective of this meeting, we and the community need to find answers to the questions raised by the refugee crisis, and that is partly why we are debating these various meetings and decisions today. On Sunday, it became manifestly obvious that the situation in the Western Balkans is extremely worrying, including politically. Tens of thousands of people are using the Western Balkans route to flee to Europe. They have no roof over their heads, they are hungry, they are crossing our borders in the middle of the night. As winter approaches, a humanitarian disaster looms, as President Juncker has warned us. I think that the 17-point plan adopted in the early hours of yesterday morning is a good plan which needs to be implemented quickly and which needs to be followed up with other measures. I was deeply worried when I left the meeting the day before yesterday. The atmosphere at the meeting was in part deeply worrying. Promises are being made and they're not delivered upon. Governments of the right and of the left sometimes think national interests are more important than community solutions. What suffers are the refugees and the cohesion of the European Union. I'd like now, therefore, to give the floor to the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear members of the European Parliament, before the briefing on the European Council on the 15th of October and the next steps ahead, I would like to say the following. The crisis, or rather challenge, that we, all of us, as a community, as the European Union, are facing now is perhaps the biggest challenge we have seen for decades. I have no doubt that this challenge has the potential to change the European Union we have built. It has the potential even to destroy achievements such as border-free travel between Schengen countries. And what is even more dangerous, it has the potential to create tectonic changes in the European political landscape. And these are not changes for the better. These are truly extraordinary times that require extraordinary measures, extraordinary sacrifices, and extraordinary solidarity. To me, as a President of the European Council, and I believe to most of us, it is paramount to ensure the unity of our Member States and of European institutions. Together we will handle this crisis. Otherwise, I do not want to think of the alternative. From the very outset of this crisis, I have underlined the importance of protecting our external borders. We do not yet have an agreement on how to do it in operational terms, but at least leaders share the view that our priority must be to protect the EU's external borders. Unfortunately, the situation will get even worse, as I warned this chamber in my last intervention. I mean, for example, the new wave of refugees from Aleppo and the region after Russian bombing attack in Syria. It was more than 100,000 new refugees in a few days. Dear members, during the last European Council, leaders gave a cautious welcome to the work of the European Commission on a deal with Turkey on migration. Here, let me personally thank Vice President Timmermans, who is working hard on the technical details. Let me stress again that a deal with Turkey only makes sense if it helps stem the migratory flows to Europe. This cooperation will not be easy. We should have no illusion that any third country, including Turkey, can replace us in protecting our borders. Second, leaders took stock of work to make 11 hotspots in Greece and Italy fully operational by the end of November. This deadline is ambitious and requires a significant acceleration of manpower and assets to Frontex and the European Asylum Support Office. For now, the European agencies have less than half of what they need. When it comes to the role of hotspots, we have started an honest debate on how they should function. This is still work in progress. Third, we discussed at length how to protect our borders. We must end at once this completely unnecessary argument between the proponents of protecting external borders and the advocates of solidarity and openness. We need both. We need to restore effective external border control to start managing the situation on our borders. This has to include stopping the illegal crossings of our borders, registration of all asylum seekers, and organisation of appropriate reception facilities. This will not in itself stop the flow, but it will reduce it significantly. In this regard, the European Council agreed that Frontex will be developed beyond its current mandate. It will be able to intervene in border crisis faster and more assertively, and it will take a lead in the return of irregular migrants. We need the European Parliament's help to do this as quickly as possible. The aim is to equip Frontex with the tools it needs to fully protect European borders. I would like to comment the impressive work already done by the members on financing for both Frontex and European Asylum Support Office. And in parallel, we will need to work on how to develop further our internal solidarity between member states. A very first step is to provide Frontex and European Asylum Support Office with all the resources they need, as well as implementing the temporary relocation mechanism to alleviate the burden from those of our member states most affected. Dear members, the crisis does not just concern Syrian refugees. 2 weeks from now, I will convene a summit of European and African leaders in Valletta. With the help of our African counterparts, it is our goal that the summit will help to forge a real Euro-African partnership on the migration issue. The European Council decided that we want to achieve concrete operational measures in a fair and balanced manner on effective return and readmission, dismantling of criminal networks and prevention of illegal migration, accompanied by real efforts to tackle root causes and to support the African socio-economic development, together with a commitment concerning continued possibilities for legal migration. We will aim at exploring possibilities for developing safe and sustainable reception capacities in the affected regions and providing lasting prospects and adequate procedures for refugees and their families, including through access to education and jobs, until return to their country of origin is possible. Finally, we will ask Member States to further contribute to the efforts made to support UNHCR, the World Food Programme and other agencies, as well as to support the EU's Regional Trust Fund responding to the Syria crisis and the EU Trust Fund for Africa. Dear President, dear members, and finally on Britain. I briefed leaders on the preparatory discussions between my officials and the UK over the last month. We welcomed Prime Minister Cameron's commitment to set out the UK's specific concerns in writing by early November. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Herr Tusk.
Thank you, Mr. Tusk.
Das Wort hat jetzt der Präsident der.
I now give the floor to the President of the Commission, Mr. Juncker.
Sehr verehrter Herr Präsident.
President of the European Council, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues.
Along the Western Balkans route, we saw refugees wading through freezing rivers. We saw them sleeping in the rain and mud. Soon, this will be snow and ice. Winter is approaching, and every day counts. Das ist genau die Ursache, Herr Präsident, wieso und weshalb.
This is precisely why, in conjunction with President Tusk, I decided that it was appropriate for us to bring together some member states of the European Union and some 3 additional countries for a summit on the West Balkan route. And I therefore invited them to Brussels. 8 heads of state and government participated in this group from the European Union. The Luxembourg Migration Minister, Mr. Asselborn, participated, and the Dutch representative of the incoming presidency also participated. Obviously also President Tusk was there and President Schulz attended. And the reason that I decided that it was appropriate to hold this summit is that obviously the refugee crisis affects not only the Western Balkan states but also the European institutions, inter alia the European Parliament. And our assistance is absolutely urgent, not least in terms of budgetary contributions. And we must take this action immediately. I'd like to extend my thanks to the European Parliament because all the proposals that have been put forward by the Commission have been taken up by you, and there's been a great deal of pressure of time. But this has enabled the European institutions to take the necessary political decisions and to implement them in an effective way. I also invited Antoni Guterres from the UNHCR and Frontex, and I invited Albania, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, likewise, because these are areas which are particularly strongly affected by the flows of refugees and the whole refugee crisis. We took this initiative with the Western Balkan states because we felt that it was absolutely essential for the Commission to take hold of the reins in this debate and to be accountable and to recognize that the member states require and wish us to meet this challenge. It's high time that we did so in as effective a way as we possibly can. Of course, ideally, we would not have wanted to have to call this summit at all. In the normal course of events, we would have preferred the Western Balkan states to be meeting together themselves in order to negotiate on the situation and to reach agreements as to what should happen. However, in these circumstances, I thought it was appropriate to bring all these people together around the table in order to have a frank and open discussion about bilateral problems, but also regional problems. And I was very happy to see that there was very constructive discussion, that the outcome of the discussion was also effective, and that we are able to ensure that the European Union will stand together in the future. Now, this is not an exceptional situation where members of the European Union need to come together to have joint discussions on a particular issue. But the fact that I needed to hold this meeting does show that the European Union is not in as good a state as it should be, because, as I say, I would much have preferred not to have to call such a summit. It should have been possible for these issues to have been discussed by and indeed largely resolved by the countries themselves. We had very frank discussion, as I said. The discussions were challenging. The issues were challenging. And not everything that we heard is the sort of contribution that I would like to hear to dialogue on that kind of topic. But it was extremely important for us to have that summit, and I think it shows that we need a common solution to what is a common problem. And it is essential that we keep focused on this task and that we keep working on it. And this is why I'm extremely grateful to all those who have made such an effort to participate in the way that they can in order to ensure that Europe is built as a joint enterprise.
Day for big political statements. It was a day to roll up our sleeves and agree on pragmatic operational measures that can be implemented immediately. Leaders committed to address three main challenges. Point number one, they committed to providing immediate shelter for all arriving refugees so that they are not left outside in sub-zero temperatures. They committed to providing food, healthcare, water, sanitation, including by relying on the EU civil protection mechanism where necessary. As a very concrete follow-up, yesterday, Croatia activated the civil protection mechanism, asking for winter tents, beds, emergency blankets and electrical heaters. I would expect Member States to contribute to this European solidarity mechanism to provide Croatia with the necessary assistance for those in need. Leaders also committed to increasing reception capacities for refugees by 100,000 places overall in Greece and the Western Balkans. I would like to commend Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras for agreeing to create 30,000 places by the end of the year, and with the help of the UNHCR, places for another 20,000 people. And I'm grateful to Antonio Guterres, who will ensure the UNHCR lends its full support to these efforts to increase reception capacities by a further 50,000 along the Western Balkans route. Second, leaders committed to managing migration flows together. We need to slow down the uncontrolled flow of people. This means registering people when they enter the European Union. This also means informing refugees about the existing rules and the consequences of a refusal to be registered. I have to say, no registration, no rights. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that, and refugees have to know this, because refugees of course have rights, and I will always defend these rights, but refugees coming to Europe have obligations too. Managing the migration flows together also means sharing information. Last week we saw countries waving through refugees from one country to the other. We saw fingers being pointed at each other, And we saw countries talking about, but not with each other. That is the politics of panic. It gives the illusion of a solution, while all it does is harm your neighbours and damage European solidarity. We are putting an end to all beggar thy neighbour policies. Instead, countries shall help their neighbours by telling each other what they are doing, exchanging information on migration flows and humanitarian capacities available. How many refugees are on their way? Where are they crossing the border? Where are they going? How many tents or blankets are currently used, and how can they be put at the disposal of the neighbour who needs them most? It's quite astonishing that we had to undertake a huge effort to convince some of our member states to inform other of our member states about the refugee flows heading to the borders. What seems, for someone who is inspired by basic common sense, surprising that we have to convene a meeting to ask member states to inform each other about the refugee movements. That again shows that the European Union is not in a good shape. We need to share the answer to simple questions like those I was mentioning. Yesterday, all countries who attended the meeting, Sunday's meeting, appointed national contact points so we can instantly share information. The Commission will monitor the implementation on a weekly basis and will hold a first conference call already this week on Thursday. Third, leaders agreed to strengthening border management. To protect Schengen, we agreed to strengthen the external EU border, in particular between Greece, Serbia, Fyrom and Albania. By the end of this week, 400 additional police officers will be deployed in Slovenia. This week, Frontex will assist Greece in registration of refugees and migrants. Countries will step up efforts to return migrants who do not need protection. To this end, the Commission stands ready to work on readmission agreements with relevant countries where we do not yet have any in place, while as continuing our work in improving the working of the readmissions agreement in place, like the one with Pakistan, for example. Un autre élément qui m'a beaucoup impressionné, tout dans le charge.
Something else that struck me very much before I just came into the chamber was the fact that all member states, pretty much without exception, had collectively addressed the issue of the huge costs which will be entailed by these policies member states will need to implement to deal with the refugee crisis. I can completely understand that concern. That's why on October the 15th, the Commission I have the honour of presiding over told member states that when it's a question of classifying the budgetary resources earmarked for assisting refugees, we will call upon the Stability and Growth Pact rules. Those will be applied, which will mean that there will be a certain amount of flexibility available as well. We're dealing with an exceptionally serious problem. So I think I can say, and say publicly, that the pact isn't the old kind of pact when we are now trying to jointly implement a pan-European policy. We are going to have a country-by-country assessment, but we will be able to bear in mind the costs entailed by refugee policy more than we've done up to now. So we'll be applying the amended version of the pact, and we'll do it on a country-by-country basis. There are countries, including some of the big member states, who aren't really doing enough. If a country makes a huge effort, then there should be a commensurate understanding of what they've done. If a country is unable to prove that it's affected by the costs entailed in the policy, we won't necessarily see the pact being applied to them in a flexible way. We need to make certain that member states show a sense of responsibility here. And then, ladies and gentlemen, the EU budget is limited. Its resources are limited, and possibilities for flexible implementation are limited too. We're really at the limit of our budgetary capacity here. The Commission has done all it can to make sure that all necessary budget elements are made available to help this effort, but the European budget is too small to deal by itself with the problems with which we're faced. So I would call upon member states, this Parliament, the European Investment Bank. I'd ask them all to think about possible methods of additional financing to find the money which we need to meet the crisis. When we have an exceptional situation, we need exceptional financing, and we'll be working in the next few weeks on this matter.
It was a day of unity. For the first time, the leaders of the Western Balkans sat together around the table and discussed the problems they are facing, and they agreed on a series of concrete and operational actions to better manage the situation. These measures come in addition to those we discussed at the European Council on the 15th of October, and President Tusk was mentioning all the decisions which have been taken on the 15th of October. On the 15th of October, and in line with what I have said in this House, I had one objective, that was to lead Member States back to the promises they made on the 23rd of September, the previous European Council. There has not been enough progress, and in some cases not even by far. We need progress in two areas in particular. First, we need to speed up, I was mentioning that, operational measures to get the hotspots and relocation working. The relocation is not working in the best way possible. And second, we need budgetary support. I made it clear before this House and again before the European Council that Member States need to do more and act faster to keep the promises made on the 23rd of September. This is essential. This is crucially essential if we want operational decisions to be implemented. At the Council, Member States told me they would stand to their promises. And we have seen updated pledges from some. But the Member States are still moving slowly at a time when they should be running. They are moving slowly, they should start to run. In September, Member States promised to send experts and reinforce our agencies. We need the experts for the agencies urgently to help register refugees, take fingerprints, help refugees in hotspot areas. The European Asylum and Support Office, EASO, asked for 374 experts. As of yesterday, 20 Member States have offered 145 experts, but we still need 2,029 more. There is also progress on border guards for Frontex. Frontex asked 775 experts and received offers of 326 so far. This is good, but it is far from being good enough. We need more. On relocation too, things are moving, but they are not moving fast enough. Member States need to do as they promised, nominate national contact points and send liaison officers to Italy and Greece and notify their reception capacity. 25 member states out of 26 obliged to do so have now appointed national contact points. 8 members have appointed liaison officers for Italy and only 3 member states for Greece. 9 member states have let us know that they can soon relocate at least 700 people. But let's not forget that we have a decision to relocate 160,000 refugees in need of international protection. The gap between pledges and what is on the table must be reduced. Otherwise, we are losing all kinds of credibility. Il y a 3 semaines,
3 weeks ago, we decided that it was absolutely essential to provide all the funding the European Union could mobilize for these purposes. And we have already used all the funding that is currently contained in the budget. Therefore, it was a question of obtaining further funding. So there will be 10 billion made available for the policy measures over the next 2 years to try to help to resolve the refugee crisis. So this is a 4.2% increase. And the 20th of September, a number of member states did sign up to dealing with the shortfalls and producing some additional funding at national level. But 2.3 billion is still a substantial shortfall, and we absolutely require to mobilize all the money that we can. 406 million is going to have to be mobilized shortly. There is still really the same 2.3 billion shortfall as there was 2 months ago, and therefore we really have to do better. It is high time that we realized this. Otherwise, we will not be up to dealing with this issue in the way that the European Union should. President Tusk talked about the summit that we're holding with African leaders, and we want to do this because the refugee crisis is not simply a European matter. It is much more than that. There's no point in thinking that there is Europe on one side and the rest of the world on the other. Far from it. We are an integral part of the global scene, and therefore I don't want to go to Valletta having failed to live up to promises that we've undertaken with various countries and many individuals. I don't want to renege on my promises to Africa, nor other countries, nor people who are in a state of desperation. And we have undertaken serious commitments, and we want to go to Valletta with many promises and much funding available that we can put on the table. I've almost concluded now, President. You know that I do tend to overrun on my speaking time. I don't want to conclude without talking about Turkey just briefly. We've been putting together a common action programme in conjunction with Turkey, and the Commission has put forward some specific proposals on that. They were largely compiled with the help of President Tusk, who has been kind enough not only to work closely with us but to give us a huge amount of assistance. Mr. Timmermans likewise has given us a huge amount of assistance in negotiations with Turkey, and I'd like to pay tribute to him on a personal note also. I'd like to thank both of these colleagues because they've done excellent work and they've helped us hugely in trying to put together a policy on how to deal with the refugee crisis. Commissioner Avramopoulos likewise is highly committed and very engaged in all the initiatives dealing with refugee policy. And therefore, I think it's absolutely essential that the President of the Commission takes up the responsibilities that are properly his in this context, but there are many others who have big responsibilities too, and I hope that none of us have failed. I think that the Commission has shown the way, and I'm glad to say that others are following.
Wir müssen, sehr verehrte Kollegen, mit der Türkei an der
Colleagues, back to Turkey. We need to work in conjunction with Turkey in order to be able to implement this common action plan. As I said, Dimitris Avramopoulos, Commissioner Hahn, Commissioner Timmermans are working on this, but we can't rest on our laurels. We have a long way still to go and a great deal we still need to do. I endorse the written papers that have been published. There are a number of hesitations and reservations as to exactly what we can do in terms of negotiations with Turkey. Obviously, there are 2.5 million refugees in Turkey. Turkey has more refugees and has had so for a longer time than we have. Therefore, now we really face two possibilities, and these are the options. We can either say that the European Union and the European institutions have outstanding issues with Turkey, human rights, press freedoms and so forth, and we can harp on about that. But where is that going to take us in our discussions with Turkey? As I said, Sir Timmermans and others who have engaged with Turkey have welcomed the fact that the Turkish government is prepared to engage with us. We know that there are shortcomings, but we need to involve Turkey in our initiatives, because Turkey agrees with us that we need to take action to try to resolve this refugee crisis in any way that, an appropriate way that we can together. We want to ensure that no more refugees come from Turkey into the European Union, and therefore we need to address that issue, and there are clearly many more refugees coming from the south still. Many refugees are coming to Turkey with a view to moving on through into European Union countries. There are other issues too. For example, all the children need to be able to go to school, and we need to ensure that we have proper opportunities put in place for children in refugee camps. There is no point in giving them places in refugee camps and giving them no future and no pathway to a future. If they are forced into living in refugee camps, then we need to work with Turkey to ensure that we set up the refugee camps and the facilities in these refugee camps that these refugees need. Turkey needs at least 3 billion euros in order to try to combat this crisis, and we have some 200 million euros in our budget as it is, but the member states are going to have to step up to the plate and provide considerably more funding, a large percentage at the very least of the 203 million shortfall to which I alluded earlier, which we absolutely need imminently. We've got to talk to Turkey certainly about visa liberalisation, about accession, about re-energising the accession negotiations. But of course we have at the same time got to stick to our decisions and positions of fundamental principle. And therefore I would make an urgent appeal to this House. I would appeal to you to help the Commission. I would appeal to you to do everything you can to help us to work closely with Turkey in order to reach agreements which we can implement, because otherwise we are going to exacerbate what is already an exceptionally serious problem and a dire situation. I'd like to add that it is important for us also to focus on the whole question of a common border agency and a Coast Guard facility. We need to do this because we need to be able to protect our external borders more effectively. We need to be able to have information in order to help the refugees. There are some who are refugees, there are some who are asylum seekers. Some will need to return because they cannot be in the European Union. Others, we hope, will be able to return to Syria in due course when the critical situation has been resolved. I'd like to thank you all for your attention. There are many critical issues in which I will continue to debate, such as economic and monetary union, with you in the future. But at the moment, obviously, this has been a matter of priority We will continue to talk about deepening economic and monetary union on the basis of the 5 Presidents' report, with which you will all be familiar. I think it's absolutely vital to involve the European Parliament at all times and in all debates, and we are certainly committed to doing that. After all, you have a co-legislative role to play, and the European Commission is well aware of that, well aware of the support that you give us and the excellent relations that exist between our 2 institutions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you to the President of the Commission. I now give the floor for the European People's Party Group to Mr. Weber. Mr. President, President of the Commission, colleagues, yesterday as I was preparing today's speech, I wrote down, yes, we're in favour of hotspots, yes, we're in favour of more development assistance, yes to quotas, yes to safe countries of origin. And then I recognized all of these things. I said to myself, I've made this speech before. So let me start by saying what the political situation is. We have the Commission declaring on Sunday that it wants to lead Europe. It wants to make headway. That became clear on Sunday. Jean-Claude Juncker made clear that this waving through has to stop. We have the legislative proposals from Commissioner Avramopoulos. Thank you for that. We in the European Parliament said we support you. That goes for the budget. And on behalf of my group, I can say on safe third countries and the permanent quota, yes, we're in favour of a fast-track mechanism. Yes, we're ready to provide the political answers to enable Europe to act. And then, President of the European Council, that takes us to the member states that are not delivering on their undertakings. When the European Council, sir, discusses the future, not in a philosophical way, it ought to be debating pragmatically and informing us of how it's going to deliver on its undertaking. President Tusk, you shoulder a weighty responsibility for the future, and we need to see from you the pressure being brought to bear on the member states who need to deliver on their undertakings, especially at the onset of winter. Colleagues, we've seen the failure of nation states. We've seen the failure of national selfishness. This is the Europe of Farage and Le Pen, a Europe that doesn't produce decisions. It's a Europe of the right who are failing to deliver the solutions, and we in the European People's Party reject that approach. We say if Jordan is helping, if Lebanon is helping, if poor countries are helping, then Europe has to help. We believe in human rights, not just Christian rights. We believe we need a proper control of the EU's external borders. That is part of the truth. Not everybody knocking on the door deserves to be let in. And if you allow me to make a political assessment, because very often in political debates I'm challenged on the role of Viktor Orban. I think we have to ensure humanitarian treatment and behavior. But when the quota was decided, the 160,000, Viktor Orban was against, but 3 socialist prime ministers were against, from Romania, the Czech Republic, and from Slovakia. The liberal leaders of the Netherlands and Denmark are not speaking out as clearly as Angela Merkel, regarding the extent to which we have to help the refugees. So I think the leading political parties should stop passing the buck. We need to make sure that our people at home are willing to shoulder the responsibility that is ours. Colleagues, in conclusion, we are seeing an increase in populism, in extremism, in the spreading of fear. In the European Parliament, we have decided that pro-Europeans are going to work together. We don't want extremists to influence legislation. That is what we have been trying to achieve. And I call on the colleagues in the House to do what they can to make sure that this is done in the Member States as well. I'm worried about Portugal. I'm worried about the influence of left-wing extremists in this case. We need to safeguard this consensus. We need to ensure that Europe's pro-democratic forces work together to shoulder the responsibility that is ours to do what is necessary in the circumstances. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. I think you have a question, Mr. Ujhelyi, to Mr. Weber.
No microphone. Thank you very much, Chairman. I think that this double speech is incredible. Last week at the Congress of the EPP, you agreed with the populistic approach that Mr. Orbán represents. One of the members of his party was elected as vice president of your party. So don't blame the socialists. Don't make us responsible, because whatever you've talked about, the national egoism, is to be searched in your party amongst your members. Stop Mr. Orbán, and then I will believe your approach.
Ja, danke schön für die.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if you didn't understand through the interpretation. When we decided on sharing the 160,000 refugees across Europe, Viktor Orbán, an EPP prime minister, was against, but so were 3 socialist prime ministers. Viktor Orbán said he was opposed, but he was prepared to implement it. Your colleague, your Slovak colleague, Robert Fico, said he wasn't even prepared to implement it. There is no point us simply passing the buck to and fro, because there are very different issues on the table. We need to keep out the influence of extremists in countries like Portugal.
So, das Wort hat jetzt für die Fraktion.
The next speaker on behalf of the Socialists and Democrats is Mr. Pittella.
Presidente Schulz.
Mr. President of the European Parliament, Mr. President of the Commission, President Tusk, I can't conceal my concern about the increase in the number of possible splits and disagreements in the European Union. It's too early to declare the EU dead, but I'm worried about all of the anti-Europeans, the anti-globals, the anti-Islams, the anti-Israelis, the anti-Russians, the anti-immigrants, anti-Europe, all of the antis all together. These movements could have the slogan of saying just I'm against everything. But I think the best way of trying to stop these vociferous movements is to actually do things. Europe will succeed when, as it acts in the way that President Juncker did on the Sunday, when it comes up with real proposals, with real solutions to the problems of the Balkans. Europe will have won when it can show that it is ready to act, as the Parliament showed through President Schulz, to implement decisions that have been taken and implement them speedily. But Europe will in particular have won and will have shown that it can overcome the viruses of nationalism and fear when it's able to come up with responses which are courageous and convincing. I would call upon all pro-European forces in this House to really get together and work together. We need to show our pro-Europeanism now, because the challenge is those who want to destroy things and those who want to try to build things, and build things according to our European ideals. We need to start implementing the list of points given to us by President Juncker this morning. The system for distributing and housing refugees, starting with the hotspot system, which will make the borders of the Union stronger, to defend Schengen, to protect European citizens, not through some nationalistic attitudes and the return to national borders. That's not the way forward. But one of the problems is that we haven't got the greater levels of coordination among member states which we need, as we decided we needed on Sunday. That needs to be brought in. The rights of refugees, as President Juncker said, haven't always been respected. They're just being treated as some kind of inhuman mass which is flowing from one border to another. The states who are most exposed to these migratory flows are spending exceptionally large amounts of money, and as Mr. Juncker said, we can call upon the Stability Pact to help them, and I do encourage the Commission to explore that avenue, so that national budgets don't have to bear this burden all alone as they try to manage our external borders. For when it comes to Turkey, we can't leave Ankara to manage the Syrian crisis by itself, so we need speedily to move forward and apply the action plan for Turkey. But we should be clear that we won't sign a blank cheque for the Erdogan government. It's not impossible that we work with Turkey on the action plan but still try to move forward when it comes to the respect for human rights and freedom of information and the respect for minorities in that country. Finally, as President Tusk said, we're on the eve of the Valletta summit. Too often we've had a simple series of formalities as far as Europe and Africa are concerned. We've been giving the African governments money. They've been trying to stem the migratory flows. But this is now moribund. We need to have a proper partnership, not just one side giving money to the other. We need to start investing intelligently in Africa, investing in African democracy, strengthening African institutions and fighting against corruption, investing in education and making sure that the fruits of growth are allocated fairly. We pro-Europeans should all commit ourselves to do more. We should commit ourselves to do all we can to sort out this crisis before it's too late. And as Danze said, this will be a proof of our nobility if we can solve this crisis.
Herr Pittella, es gibt den Wunsch des Abgeordneten.
Mr. Christoforou would wish to put a question to you, Mr. Pittella. Is that in order?
President, there is no doubt that we know that millions of refugees need to stay in Turkey and to be looked after. My question to Mr. Pittella is this. Does he agree that the refugee crisis is something where all countries have got to show sensitivity, including Turkey? And in this particular case, the fact is that there has been pressure exerted on the EU by Turkey in order to get certain concessions. And it seems to me that we've got to have the full respect for the Ankara Protocol, and before we do anything to accommodate Turkey, we must make sure that they do their bit as well, and they respect their obligations as a candidate country. And certainly there is a humanitarian side, and this is now being abused. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, colleague. I must say that that was really slightly pleonastic, because I said very clearly in my remarks that we have got to send a clear signal to Turkey. We've got to implement the action plan, and at the same time we must advance on the terrain of respect for human rights, freedom of information and minority rights as well. Therefore, it is not in any sense that we are relinquishing respect for our principles, and that extends to the Ankara Protocol. It means also we've got to help Turkey and not leave them alone to face the brunt of the Syrian crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. For the ECR Group now, Mr. Kamall.
Thank you very much.
Lielas paldies.
Programmed, but it's clear from this debate that it's not gone away, and it's not going away anytime soon. But let's be clear, we've got to get away from the well-rehearsed arguments of whether you are pro-European or you're anti-European. Let's get away from the arguments of those who want to do nothing and those who think that we can do everything. So instead of a stop-start approach, let's be clear about what we need to stop doing, and actually let's be clear about what we need to start doing. Stop sending out a signal that anyone is welcome. Start focusing on helping those genuinely seeking refuge. Stop driving refugees into the arms of the traffickers. Start helping people nearer their homes. Stop individual countries opening their borders to all one day, forcing others to close theirs, and start being clear about what each country can do and is doing to help. Because we need to face the reality now. This is not just a migration crisis. This is not just a refugee crisis. It is in danger of becoming a geopolitical crisis. In Syria, a proxy conflict is unfolding. Russia doing all it can to destabilise the EU's borders to focus our attention away from the Ukraine. The Balkans in danger of destabilising. So against this background, we've had the Commission 10-point plan. We have the European Council roadmap. And now we have the 17-point plan from Sunday's summit. But all these plans are no substitute for action. So to solve the crisis, we first have to stabilise it, accepting only the most vulnerable, genuine refugees from the camps, as identified by the UNHCR, returning those that seek to bypass that system. But even with such a system in place, we have to take some refugees into our countries. We have a moral obligation. Yet some countries are doing far more than others. Some countries are struggling to cope. Some countries are donating huge sums. Some countries are paying huge bucks, while others are passing the buck. So all countries need to understand the scale of the situation and help with coordinated action. And when I say all countries, I do not just mean all EU countries, I mean all countries. So while we should acknowledge and support the contribution of Turkey, Jordan and Lebanon, we should also be asking, when will the richer Arab countries and the USA step up? Closer to home, EU frontline states and the Balkans need to be helped. Borders need to be strengthened. Money and resources need to go into processing and returns. But we need to be fair but firm, helping refugees close to their homes, welcoming some to our countries, but telling economic migrants to apply through existing legal migration channels and not being seen to jump the queue over those who have applied legally. Let's uphold these principles to save lives rather than encourage people to risk their lives. Do you know, our grandparents confronted the problems of their generation who had fought 2 world wars. They allowed our generation to enjoy a longer period of sustained peace and prosperity than any generation ever before. Never take that for granted, for now our world is changing. Shifting power, west to east, wars on our doorstep, terrorism at home, living longer but reproducing less. These new challenges will need new solutions. And history has taught us that to face the really big challenges, we need to work together as allies, but stand up to those who seek to dictate to us. Our grandparents had the vision to meet the challenges of their times. Our children will face a whole new set of challenges. So now it's our turn to do something for our children and grandchildren. Face today's challenges or retreat to the past. So let's stop sending false hope to the millions thinking of coming here, that they all have a future in the EU. Let's move on from roadmaps and action plans and get on with helping those in need. Let's stop pointing fingers and setting quotas and start delivering. For the sake of the refugees, for the sake of the citizens of our countries, and for the sake of the future stability of this continent.
Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
Colleagues, we are very far behind the original timetable. I just wish to bring to your attention the fact that we're in fact about 30 minutes behind. When we get any requests for the floor, we get a great rash of blue cards. Please recall what the purpose of the blue card is. It is to try and bring about greater clarity, and it gives somebody an opportunity to pose an intermediate question. But what we're seeing is that people are sticking up their blue cards before the person has even been allocated the floor. That's not the point. It isn't the point to get yourself a little more speaking time. Mr. Coburn, you had a question, I believe. Mr. Coburn, you have a question for Mr. Kamall. No great surprise that you should wish to put one, but I'd ask Mr. Kamall if he would accept the question.
Mr. Kamall, the only way to control the UK's borders, when will you and Mr. Cameron finally get it into your heads that the only way to control the borders is by leaving the EU? Do you have any other method of doing it other than that? Thank you.
Well, Mr. Coburn, it's great to see that you paid attention to what Mr. Schulz was saying about the purpose of these questions. You will have your chance to have your say when the referendum comes. And let us not forget, it was a Conservative government that delivered that referendum, not you guys shouting from the sidelines. Thank you very much.
For
the Liberal Group, Mr. Verhofstadt has the floor.
Mr. President, I think that we shall have more and more of these small British interruptions on the British referendum, but applause, applause. Thank you, thank you. So, dear colleagues, the first thing that I want to do is to say to Manfred Weber that this is not a contest, Manfred, this refugee crisis, between liberals, socialists or Christian Democrats. It's not a contest. In any way, we always lose against you, because if you have in your side Orban, who is a tough guy, and Merkel, who show compassion, you always win. And you're always right. The reality, it is not a contest between us. It is a contest between those nationalists and populists who want to abuse this refugee crisis to get rid of Europe and to destroy the European Union. That's the real contest. And not between us. So let's stop to make accusations to say this government and that government. The problem is the governments in Europe. Because that is what Jean-Claude Juncker has showed in 25 minutes. And I thank him that he has done it in a very detailed way. What he has said was a long list of decisions taken on the European level and not implemented by the member states for months now. When it concerns relocation, not enough have been done. When it concerns the budget, not enough have been done. When it concerns sending civil servants for the external borders, not enough has been done. The problem is not here between political groups. The problem is that member states are still not understanding that on the European level they can only manage this problem. That is what we are facing today. And there we stand together. There is no reason to make a battle between us, because this battle is only good for them there, by their blue cards, to attack the European project. Because it is an existential crisis that can only be overcome if, based on the Commission, Mr. Tusk, now the Council is deciding on what is, in my opinion, the first thing to do, that is the European Border and Coast Guard, so that we can regain control over our borders. That doesn't mean that we have to create a fortress Europe. That means that it is together, in Greece, in Bulgaria, that we have to control the border, register the different refugees who are coming, making the facilities so that they can live in good circumstances and not with the images that we have seen the last days and the last weeks. And it is there that we can make the difference between those who are economic migrants and real refugees. And it is there where we can organize the relocation. So if I have one plea to Mr. Tusk, then it is, let us work together, Mr. Tusk. I know it's not your fault, it is the Council, that at least in the December Council they are deciding on this European border and coast guard, because the Greek border doesn't exist, the Bulgarian border doesn't exist. The Greek border and the Bulgarian border, that's also the German border, the French border, the Dutch border, the Belgian border. It is our common border, so that means it's our common responsibility. And that is what you have to decide. Because it is there where the Balkan route can be stopped. It's not in the Balkans itself, it's on the Bulgarian border. In Greece, there we have to create this European border and coast guard that has to be multinational and that has to deal with registering and at the same time also with the relocation. And at the second point, I think, is that in the Council, my proposal to you is, don't give them a Christmas break, to your colleagues in the Council. If they cannot decide now on this common asylum system that we definitely need, and at this common economic migration system that we desperately need, because everybody knows that many people are abusing the asylum system at the end to come into Europe. That is at stake. In December, that's in a few weeks, don't give them a break, don't go on holiday, keep them there in that building, that Eastern European building type there in Europe, where the Council for the moment has his seat, and make these three crucial decisions. And finally, and that's my last plea to you, Mr. Tusk, and I know that you are in favour, take the decision once and forever to give a mandate to Mrs. Mogherini to start also initiatives on her level, on the level of Europe, to end the source of this crisis. Nobody talked about it. The source of this crisis is the ongoing conflict in Syria, and we have looked away for years of that conflict. It's time that the European Council gives a mandate to Mogherini to start really, in the name of Europe, to be involved. Because I find it a shame, I find it outrageous that in Vienna, you were there, Mrs. Mogherini, in Vienna a few days ago. In Vienna, there is a meeting, in Vienna, in the middle, in the center of Europe, there is a meeting about Syria, and who is on the table? The US, Russia, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And no European around the table. It looks to me that at least in the Congress of Vienna in 1815, was also in Vienna, we were around the table. This time, in the 21st century, we do it in Europe and we are not even present. It's like with the summit in the Azoren, organized by Mr. Barroso about Iraq. There was also no European around the table. And there, in the middle of Europe, not the middle, at the outside of Europe, there was also decided on something. So this time, my plea, let's give a mandate to Mrs. Mogherini, and please, Mrs. Mogherini, use it fully, break the door open of these meetings, and be present and represent the European point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank
you very much, Mr. Verhofstadt. Without great surprise, Mr. Etheridge has a card. I assume it's for you.
Ja, bitteschön, Herr Etheridge. Dann
Mr. Etheridge, please fire away.
Seeking clarification from Mr. Verhofstadt. You claim that us with the blue cards, we're terrible people because we try and get this debate going, and you list all the things we're against everything you stand for, and then you list it all: more immigration, more Europe, more state. Surely, sir, the truth is that we aren't against everything, but those of us on this side who seek to get debate going are actually pro-debate, pro-democracy and pro-freedom, whilst being anti-EU and all of the things that you and your friends seek to push forward. Surely, sir, that is the truth, and that is why blue cards and debate are so important and you don't like them.
I have nothing against blue cards because they are blue, so the colour of my group is blue, so I have nothing against. And secondly, I have nothing against blue cards, it's also the colour of the European Union. So every time you wave your blue card, I say, yes, we have converted one of these Eurosceptics, he is using the European colour. So continue for me, I like your blue cards.
Für die Vereinigte Linke hat jetzt das Wort.
The United European Left, Mr. Iglesias.
Thank you, President. The first time I took the floor here was 15 months ago, representing the GUI group. It was an honour to do so and to run against you to be President of this Parliament. Since then, we have seen changes in Europe, and we have sought to change Europe to make it less tough on the weak and less complicit with the powerful. I believe that we need to continue that fight that we began 15 months ago. 15 months ago, I talked about Spanish fighters fighting against fascism, those that really sought to see a social democratic Europe come to pass, a Europe that respects human rights. We heard xenophobic cries and statements in this chamber. I made it clear that they would not succeed. Now, I have heard also much hypocrisy, crocodile tears expressed in this chamber when talking about human rights. Mr. Weber, you talked about what might happen in Portugal. Well, should we not respect democracy and human rights? The wishes expressed by Portuguese citizens that may or may not appeal to you. Perhaps I could say something to the Liberals. Now, for 15 months, I do apologise, I've not been able to pronounce your name despite practising in front of the mirror. Now, you talk about Liberals, Democrats, and it is true that you agreed with the other parties on fundamental principles, but what we've seen is misery and humiliation continue. We're here once again to talk about war, families at the borders of Europe. Europeans, we cannot forget what war implies. Poverty, misery. We cannot forget those scourges. If we humiliate those people knocking on our door, we're humiliating Europe. Mr. Weber, we would see an end to the welfare state, social rights, labour rights. We need to call the governments to account when they are in hock to the financial powerhouses. Mr. Juncker, you, as Minister for Finance, were in support of secret negotiations with multinationals, tax revenue paid of just 1%, where citizens were forced to pay hand over fist. You, Mr. Juncker, and people like you, Mr. Pittella, made it possible for Mr. Juncker to be present here in this chamber. The Socialists and the EPP worked together. So, Mr. Pittella, don't claim to be on the side of the people and put an end to this cursed grand coalition. Let me come back to Spain. Now, I would like to see the Spanish government rid of people like you, and I will return there. But before I leave, let me say that the refugee crisis will not be resolved through policies and tears, but responsible policies. That is what we need, responsible action, work for peace rather than fostering war. We need to help those fleeing misery. Let's not continue to wreak havoc on the dignity of Europe, Mr. Juncker.
Das Wort hat für die Fraktion.
Now for the Green Group, Mrs. Harms. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Weber, if you really wish to contribute to a constructive solution to the problem, then please give Mr. Seehofer a ring and tell him that instead of always just letting loose in public, he might pick up the phone and talk to Mr. Faymann and Mrs. Merkel now and again. I think that in his position would be a useful thing to do and would be of benefit to all of us. Let me try first of all in this debate to get something straight. I don't think that we are primarily dealing with a deep crisis of the European Union. Crisis, war, this is what's going on outside of the European Union at the moment, and many other peoples have encountered far more problems than we are experiencing in the European Union hitherto. And if we don't keep trying to conflate this and talking always about our own problems first of all, we'll never be in a position to actually contribute to a solution to the problem in Syria or the environment or Sahara or in the Mediterranean. And it's pretty terrifying for me how navel-gazing we are in our discussion. So I think the big pressure of problems that we're experiencing at the moment and that we keep talking about is really the result of the wrong refugee and migration policy that we've been pursuing now for decades. The European Union felt far too comfortable for too long with this Dublin regulation, which tended to try and limit the issue to the border countries, the countries on the margins of Europe. And if we hadn't had ourselves shaken up by ships and boats going down on the Mediterranean, then we would have maintained this basic level of indifference vis-à-vis the problem in the Mediterranean. So it's not easy at this stage to switch off that way of thinking and to get past our indifference. But I do think that the European Union is strong enough to do that were we to stop trying to break up the European Union as part of that effort. I think, Mr. Juncker, that it is right that the decisions have been taken to do more to help resolve the situation, improve the situation for refugees in Turkey and also in other neighbouring countries to Syria. But what I think is wrong, and this is an old mistake, is that in the attempt to do something right, you ally yourself with a man who in his country is doing exactly the wrong thing. I'm talking here about President Erdogan. There's a big media group in Turkey which has been taken, which has been occupied by the police right now in Turkey and has AKP people put in place. So think very carefully about what you wish to do in continuing with Turkey. I think that the Balkan summit that took place last weekend was quite right, and I think we've finally managed to admit, and this is a bit of a breakthrough, that along the Balkan route we've got a humanitarian catastrophe situation, and the European Union now, right now, is responsible for ensuring that we bring people an opportunity to, because their countries have been destroyed, and the European Union is a space in which it is possible to function to the benefit of citizens. I would only underscore at the same time that I also believe, quite apart from solving the acute problems, that we need to think about long-term changes as well. What are we going to get in place of Dublin? What will future refugee and immigration policy look like in Europe, and how are we going to arrange our borders in such a way that we don't just shut ourselves off or militarize ourselves, as sometimes happens under Frontex, but that we guarantee European values, fundamental rights, and that we bring about a greater degree of, or a new degree of openness in the construction of this new European border policy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Herzlichen Dank, Frau Harms. Für die
Thank you. On behalf of the EFDD, now Mr. Farage.
This migrant crisis begins to overwhelm the European Union, and yes, it is an existential crisis. Perhaps we should ask ourselves, what really is the true nature of this project? Because I've heard a lot today about rights. Well, what about democratic rights? Because I think what we're seeing is an increasingly authoritarian European Union that crushes democratic rights and then actually crows about it. Every single time there's a crisis, it's national democracy that loses. We saw back in 2011 the Italian Prime Minister Berlusconi, sounding Eurosceptic, removed and replaced by a puppet Prime Minister. We saw exactly the same thing happen in Greece in 2011. Mr Papandreou threatened a referendum on Euro membership. There was a coup against him. He was replaced by a puppet. In this migrant crisis, we've seen 4 countries, led, I guess, by the strongest, Hungary, making it clear they want no part of EU migrant quotas, only to find themselves crushed through EU trickery and made to accept the very thing that they'd said no to. And I'll never forget seeing the Greek Prime Minister, Mr Tsipras, sitting just over there, having won a general election, and then come to this House to be told the manifesto was unacceptable and it must be ditched. But I think all of this has reached a new low this week with Portugal, virtually unremarked upon by the media, and yet for those that don't know, there is now, following the general election, a left-wing majority with a socialist plan for Portugal, and yet the President of Portugal, Mr Silva, is refusing them office on the grounds that they represent anti-European forces, and is allowing the minority Conservative pro-EU Prime Minister to stay in place. This is the modern-day implementation of the Brezhnev doctrine. This is exactly what happened to states living inside the USSR. What has been made clear here with Greece and indeed with Portugal is that a country only has democratic rights if it's in favour of the project. If not, those rights are taken away. And perhaps none of this should surprise us. As Mr Juncker has told us before, there can be no democratic choice against the European treaties. And the German finance minister, Mr Schäuble, has said elections change nothing. There are rules. I think for anyone that believes in democracy, Portugal should be the final straw. It should be the warning that this project, to protect itself and all its failings, will destroy the individual rights of people and of nations. My country has always believed in parliamentary democracy so strongly that twice in the last century it risked everything to fight for parliamentary democracy, not just for Britain, but for the rest of Europe too. And I actually believe that for all of us that believe in democracy and want to see it re-implemented, the British referendum offers a golden opportunity.
Lauristin, bitte schön.
Go ahead.
Mr Farage, you compared situation in EU country Portugal with the situation in previous USSR. I know you don't have experience of living in USSR. We have. Can you please bring example where Brezhnev or somebody else leading Soviet Union was confronting results of democratic elections in one of USSR republics or members?
Well, actually, although I have to say I wasn't around at the time of the Hungarian uprising, it did happen, and we saw a similar one happening in Czechoslovakia in 1968. And just let me tell you what the Brezhnev Doctrine says, shall I? Because I'm sure you remember it. It says, when forces that are hostile to socialism try to turn the development of a socialist country towards capitalism, it becomes not only a problem of the country concerned, but a common problem and a concern of all socialist countries. I think what you need to do is cross out socialist and put European Union, and it fits like a glove.
Das Wort hat jetzt
on behalf of the ENF, Mr. de Graaff.
Voorzitter, mevrouw Merkel.
President, when Chancellor Merkel last week, she went to visit the Sultan of Turkey, and in so doing she sealed the fate of Europe. Turkey gets fast-track access to the European Union in exchange for restricting the flow of migrants. This rings the bankruptcy of democracy, where Germany simply decides for everyone else. The EU abolishes itself and becomes incorporated in a new Ottoman Empire. External borders cannot be made 100% watertight, and yet the restoring internal borders is taboo. The European elite would rather sell itself out to the beast of Ankara. Forget human rights. As Erdogan bombards his own people, as he cooperates with ISIS, abolishes democracy in Turkey, and stifles freedom of expression in violence. Only in 1913 were the Turks definitively expelled from the Balkans, and only then did the murder and rape of Christian populations end. And the EU is bringing back the wars of religion. With Islam, children are raped as brides, women are second-class chattels, and infidels are persecuted and murdered. When Mrs. Merkel says that Islam belongs to Europe, she repudiates all the Christian and humanitarian values of Christendom and makes herself complicit in the abuse in detention centres, with rapes, persecution of Christians on a massive scale. And that's going to happen in every town and every village. That is Islam, a takeover of the West. And we must stop the invasion, seal the borders, and Turkey must never become a member of our EU. Thank you very much.
Now, on behalf, now we will hear from the non-attached member, Diane Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. President. In listening to this morning's debate, I hope that what we have heard is a more realistic approach to the issues facing European nations in dealing with the flows of refugees and migrants currently heading towards Europe. I understand that many of those coming are fleeing persecution, but I fear that the initial response by some European nations may have consigned even more vulnerable people to trafficking and exploitation by criminal gangs. President Tusk, you focused this morning on the matter of securing borders, concluding that even though deals with third countries are possible, no third country can replace us in protecting our external borders. President Juncker, you indicated that we need to slow down the uncontrolled flow of people. If this is a more realistic approach, it is late but welcome. Of course, it is only part of the answer. It requires a dual approach, stability in the region and promoting policies to encourage economic growth. However, I am perturbed by the tone of some of the leaders' comments in this debate this morning. And let me address Mr Weber's intemperate outburst on behalf of my constituents in the United Kingdom. We are not a nation of the extremes, but a compassionate people who have mandated our government to give aid to the Syrian refugee crisis. In fact, we are the second largest bilateral donor of aid to the refugee crisis in Syria, and one of the few countries working to fulfil our Millennium Development Goals. Finally, it is disgraceful that from the President of Council and Commission this morning, while we've heard much about the role of European nations and the need for ever more funding from those European nations, you have ignored the potential contribution of the Gulf states in resolving this very difficult situation. It is time we ensured that these states stepped up to the mark and took on their moral responsibility to deal with this crisis along with the rest of us. Thank you.
We will now hear from Mr. Reul from the EPP. President, colleagues, the issue of refugees, this is a huge problem. There can be no doubt. From morning to evening, I hear about how complicated this is. I hear finger pointing who is responsible. I hear others say what were the mistakes done in the past, and then we have the Commission and Council working on tangible steps, and then nothing happens at the end of the day. That is what bothers people. It is our job to resolve problems, not discuss them, not just pay lip service to them. People will have a different attitude if they see their politicians taking action, if they see the problems being resolved, steps being implemented. Now, this is something that concerns other fields too, not just the refugee issue. If we could see action and problems being resolved, then we would see fewer problems at European level. So we now have tangible steps agreed on Sunday. We saw a meeting scheduled where those involved came round the same table. Not everyone attended. There were shortcomings. Not all decisions went as far as they could, but tangible action has been agreed upon to help people to tackle the difficulties to hand. And so I would just issue an appeal to Council, Commission, Parliament, and Council has the biggest task here. My appeal to you is now live up to your commitments, pay out the funding, give the Member States the leeway to take action, and ensure that the Frontex guards can take action, that they can put that plan into operation. So thank you very much. This was a first step, and we need to take the second step and get this right.
Dragi colegi, vreau să vă spun înainte să-i dau cuvântul colegei Fajon, before I give you the...
Thank you very much. Before giving the floor to Mrs. Fajon, I would like to launch an appeal, which is to everyone, please respect the speaking time, because we are behindhand, and we've got the vote, and our guests are here. President Tusk, President Juncker will be speaking at the end, and likewise the vote is going to be a major exercise, and then there is another debate at 3 p.m. So I would launch an urgent appeal to everyone to please respect the speaking time. Now, Madame Fajon, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman. August Assembly, I have visited the reception centers at the Slovenian borders. I stood by the line of thousands of tired, ill refugees. Look at the footage. These are people. But who are those that drive them back into the cold river during the night? Is Croatia not liable to respect European rights? Croatia requested additional tents yesterday. Whenever I speak about tolerance and solidarity, I lack credibility. Whenever I talk to my Slovenian constituents, European leaders are undermining my credibility. The sending of migrants to unnotified spots is unacceptable. In the past 10 days, 80,000 people entered Slovenia. This is just as much as if there were 3.2 million people entering Germany. Slovenia will be forced to kneel. Chaos will arise. And the predictions of the intolerant xenophobes will come true. It is not true that things cannot be done. Some people don't want to do that. I suggest that people who do not want to take decisions, let the decision-making be in the hands of those who have hearts, common sense and courage.
Legutko, 2 minutes.
Mr. Legutko, 2 minutes.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the numbers do matter, but I'm afraid the numbers do not balance. It is said that this year 700,000 migrants have come to Europe, but we've been also told that 800,000 people have come to Germany, that every day 5,000 people cross the Austrian border. And there are also the Balkan countries, there are the Mediterranean countries, and one doesn't have to be very strong in mathematics to know that the first number, 700,000, is not correct, and it should be higher. Chancellor Merkel said in this chamber that in the next years about 60 million people will probably leave their homes in the turbulent areas in the search of a better future elsewhere. And President Tusk said that what we have been going through now can be compared to the great migration of peoples from the prehistoric times. If at least a third of those 60 million people will come to Europe in the next years, we will have a new medium-sized nation on our territory. So what conclusions can we draw from these numbers? First, by avoiding the problem of numbers, the politicians, I'm afraid, conceal the gravity of the issue. Second, the instruments that the EU proposed are certainly not adequate. And third, I have an unpleasant feeling that the instruments are used more to assert the EU power over nation states than to face what is possibly the greatest challenge that Europe has confronted since the end of the World War II. So this strategy failed, but it is hardly a consolation in view of what the future might bring. Thank you.
Domnul Deprez.
Thank you very much. Mr. Deprez for 1.5 minutes. Mr. President, first and foremost, can I congratulate the President of the Commission, congratulate you for the initiative you took and the 17 measures which were adopted. Those who, like you, saw these terrible images of refugees, men, women, children, going chest through a freezing river know that this is the humanitarian response. That said, 2 reflections. The external frontier is a common one, as you reminded us, and what's common has to be managed on a commonality basis. And Frontex, with its current mandate, its statute, is it really able to do that? Frontex, in its present form, is really a supplicant, which goes cap in hand to member states to request assets, boats, expert coast guards. It's not an operator capable of organising. We've got to put an end to this facade. If the common border is going to be a common police and a common border, then Frontex's mandate's got to be looked at again, dusted down, common procedures, a common coast guard under the authority of a common operator. You also recalled the need to cooperate with transit countries, in particular Turkey, and I would agree. But negotiations with Erdogan, under the pretext of combating terrorism, bombards the Turks, and that plays into the hands of ISIS. They're not doing it. Erdogan is doing nothing about the Bodrum smuggling industry, which has grown up. The only rule we must respect. The European Union, in response, if the Turks respond in the current outlook approach, then we've got to respond, looking at the prevailing winds as well. Thank you very much. Mrs.
Thank you. The Slovene police used tear gas against refugees. That's a liberal government in Slovenia. In Hungary, you have a party in power that belongs to EPP and uses dogs and other weapons at their borders. On the 17th of October, the Bulgarian police shot and killed a Pakistan national at their border. But I think what really embodies the way the EU treats refugees is the Czech government, which is marking, putting a stamp on the arms of the refugees and rounding them up in something akin to concentration camps. The European Union is supposed to respect human rights, but what we are seeing is total disrespect for human rights. We should ensure that the different political groups here expel the member parties that are abusing human rights. So, Mr. Pittella, Mr. Weber, your groupings, your member parties are undermining solidarity and destroying human rights. Thank you.
Mrs. Keller, 1 minute.
Excuse me, avem un blue card. Acceptați un blue card?
Sorry, blue card. You accept blue card?
Mr. Peterle.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I have to react to this very pretentious gossiping of my colleague about Slovenia. I would like to ask her the following. How would you react if a conflict situation arose between migrants themselves? We had to handle this to prevent this from spreading into something worse. The Slovenian police acted in a responsible manner.
I believe that if we wish to be responsible, we must respect human rights and should not use tear gas on those fleeing war and barbarity. That is not the way in which you respect human rights.
Keller, 1 minute.
Thank you, Ms. Keller, 1 minute.
Thank you. Actually, and unusually, I'm not all that disappointed of what came out on Sunday, I have to say, unlike Mr. Schulz or some other voices here, because finally the heads of state present have at least realized that we have a humanitarian crisis at hand. I mean, it should be obvious that refugees need shelter, food, water, the things you've mentioned, Mr. Juncker, but for once, finally, we have it in the conclusion, so let's hope that all of those things are finally going to be delivered. And I'm also happy that the Geneva Convention and complying with the EU law was highlighted. I'm just not sure how you're going to bring that together with sending people back to Afghanistan, because Afghani refugees are recognized as refugees inside the European Union. They almost fulfill the threshold of 75% to be eligible for relocation. So Afghanistan certainly is not a safe place. And again, unfortunately, the mini-summit on Sunday failed to address the crucial questions of a new and fair distribution system, fair for member states and for refugees, and the question of legal access. Those are the issues we actually need to address, not some weird Fortress Europe issues.
Mulțumim. Domnul Paksas, 1 minut.
Thank you very much. Mr. Paksas, 1 minute.
Pirmininke, kolegos, 3 pastebėjimai po viršūnių.
Mr. President, 3 comments in the wake of the summit. First of all, finally, an admission has been made that Europe hasn't protected its external borders hitherto, and the decision has been taken that measures must now be put in place to ensure that that can be dealt with. Secondly, there will be 10 billion euros made available by the Council for the African and Asian countries in the hope that that will help put a stop to the flow of migrants. That's naive. Thirdly, colleagues, we need a new migration policy which will only allow borders to be open to refugees fleeing war regions, and these decisions on the accommodation of refugees from some member states and their governments also needs to be clarified. We mustn't turn a blind eye to the fact that the situation is different from the way it looks.
Mr. Briouat, 1 minute.
President, We are seeing summit after summit in Europe, and the refugee flows are unstoppable. The mayor in Calais talks about exceptional cultural riches, but now we're seeing inhabitants having to move house because they are at the mercy of aggressive refugees. So that is what we have in the European Union, and the European Union shoulders full responsibility, as do the servile governments that do not protect their own borders. The summit will not change anything because it insists that it will foster legal migration channels and the strengthening of protection for migrants. These are irresponsible proposals. I, on the contrary, would be in favour of immediate suspension of the Schengen Agreement, reintroduction of checks at national borders so that migrants can be placed in detention centres and immediately sent back to their home countries. There we have a clear message for migrants.
Epitideos, 1 minute.
Mr. Epitideos, 1 minute. Thank you very much, Mr. President. The decisions which were taken by the Council are the result of the panic which has overtaken the leaders of Europe because of the sudden and massive influx of illegal immigrants. And the only thing which the summit was able to do was to upgrade the role of Turkey, a country which to a large extent is responsible for a worsening of the migration problem. Instead of the European Union saying, Turkey, you are a candidate, you don't meet the Copenhagen criteria, instead of saying you must meet your obligations, what they're doing is allowing thousands of illegal immigrants to find their way into Greece. And at the same time, through Chancellor Merkel, they are being offered, Erdogan is being offered 3 billion euros, even though he was not happy with that and wanted more, in fact, twice that amount.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący. Zgadzam się w pełni z diagnozą, którą...
President, thank you very much. I agree fully with Mr. Tusk's diagnosis. Migration is something that is changing, has changed the EU, the internal balance of power within the EU, as well as the political scene in specific member states. If our estimates of the number of migrants are correct, what the specific amount is irrelevant. The migrants are an existential challenge for all of us in all our countries. And I think it is good the EU has agreed we should help migrants at the source in the countries of the Middle East and Africa, and such decisions have already been taken. It is good we have all agreed that our priority should be to protect our borders. We cannot help those who are already in the EU if our borders are as porous as they are now, because this only is a pull factor for those who want to come to Europe from places like Syria, for instance. We have agreed on help 1 billion euros for migrants in the Middle East. Is this enough? Probably not. We also need to help Turkey. Turkey is already home to 2.5 million refugees. Maybe if we help Turkey, Turkey will put a stop to this migration pressure which is put on us now. We may hope to see the situation in Syria improve. We have to do our utmost, to our share. We have to cooperate with the UN in order to combat this great international crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you accept the blue card?
Do we have a... Yes. Okay, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Honourable colleague, you avoided figures and specific numbers, but I still have a question. Do you have specific figures at your disposal or ratios of migrants? How many are really those who are eligible for asylum, and how many of them are the ones that we should return home?
Szanowny kolego, ja nie mówiłem o tym.
Well, dear colleague, I haven't mentioned any specific groups or breakdowns, how many of those are refugees or economic migrants. This still requires an in-depth analysis. If we had a normal system for registration of migrants, we don't know. We know now 700,000 people up to September this year, but any analysis to be carried out still needs to be carried out, and the representatives of the Council and Commission have already said that we need assistance of experts who would help us. Who are the migrants or refugees? Thank you.
Mr. Fleckenstein, 1 minute.
Mr. President, colleagues, I don't want to just talk about the leaders' meeting. It's amazing what we've had to consider to be a success, so let's leave that there. But I would like to thank the Commission, and in particular Mr. Timmermans, for the negotiations that have been conducted with Turkey. I think you've earned that praise because, first of all, you have been trying to get to grips with the Syrian refugee issue for a long time, and then you've also been putting in place the measures required to make it happen and to help refugees and those that are going to be welcoming them. But we shouldn't just throw our values overboard in this process, because we also have to realize at the same time that morality isn't going to solve the problem on its own. And there are two things I would ask of you. That we should try, first of all, to work with USA and Iran and Russia to try and bring an end to the war in Syria, and we'll only do that if we are pragmatic in our approach.
Mr. Marias has got 1 minute. President Juncker, in 5 days last week, and despite the storms, the island of Lesbos got tens of thousands of new refugees, despite the fact that the population of the island itself is only 70,000, 80,000 people. Now, compared to the population of each country, and percentages issued by the European Council, we now have much higher a percentage than was agreed in the redistribution key. And this is at a time when the memorandum has borne down so hard on the country. Greece cannot be turned into a huge favela for immigrants and refugees. And this you clearly have to understand. President Juncker, you must understand that protecting the sea borders is for the sovereign authorities of Greece and not anyone else. We must stop accommodating Turkey because they are tolerating the trafficking networks. Thank you very much.
Mr. Juncker, thank you for staging the leaders' meeting on Sunday. It was very useful. I did not like very much your critical tone regarding the heads of state and governments along the Western Balkans route. You should be critical towards everyone. The leaders of those countries are dealing with a 100% problem that exceeds their capacities. Therefore, they were nervous. Yet the meeting was useful. My country, Slovenia, is a small country. It lies along the Western Balkans route, the route taken by more than 10,000 different refugees and migrants. Today we are all along the Balkans route. We are facing a problem that was not caused by nature or the fate. It is a problem caused by catastrophic decisions made by politicians. The masses of people coming from unfortunate countries are here. They came to us as used to was also in the past. Also in the past we accepted many people of different backgrounds, religions. But today Europe is different. We all should stick to our values, and based on these values we should act. Not only the European Union, but individual governments, NGOs, humanitarian organizations. We need to act according to solidarity, tolerance, political solutions of problems in the Middle East, including all stakeholders involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Papadimoulis, 1 minute. Thank you very much, President of Commission, President of Council. It's time for us to go from words to deeds. And so far we've seen delay, we've seen postponement. Even in the taking of the decisions which have been taken, we need a viable EU approach, which is humanitarian, in essence, to cope with these movements of migrants. If we do not do that, then this is going to threaten the whole process of European unification with breakdown. And at the same time we've seen a resurgence of xenophobic, racist, fascist sentiments. My country of Greece cannot bear this burden by itself. It bears the greatest burden, it's bearing the brunt, and it cannot simply become a kind of limbo for human souls. Every day the Mediterranean is becoming ever more of a graveyard. And when are we going to look again at Dublin II? When are we going to see peacemaking European initiatives to end the conflicts in Syria? When are we going to do something about the Stability Pact for the countries bearing the brunt, the financial brunt? Thank you. Mrs. Lunacek, one minute.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Juncker, Commission President, let me say that it is a good thing that we had a meeting of leaders on Sunday. Europe's future is contingent upon decision makers getting together and talking rather than pitting their forces against one another. They need to work together to come up with solutions. Mr. Juncker, you're quite right to say that this should be the default setting. We need to also work with countries that have not yet joined the European Union. We are dealing with human lives here, people fleeing bombs. There was something missing. That is clear. We need to see the commitments implemented. We need the funding to be stumped up, and we need a fair distribution of refugees across all member states. Mr. Tusk, you have to put pressure on the council members to ensure that they honour their commitments. Common asylum system, that would be necessary so that we don't have infighting between the different participants.
Thank you very much. Next is Mr. Castaldo for 1.5 minutes. Thank you, President. Rome is discussing and Sagunto is in flames, and that's mutatis mutandis, exactly what's happening here now. The human stream of despair is moving in order to look for survival, and we are seeing tens of thousands of new transit people in Croatia on a monthly basis. Frontex is trying to be beefed up, but we must crack down on the smuggling networks. Steps have been taken, but they're small steps. We need a system of European asylum with legal channels. We have many more steps to take. We've got to revise Dublin II. We've got to change tack in policy in Africa and also in Syria. One little line on the practical need to tackle the root causes, socio-economic, of the malaise in Africa. And we are talking to Erdogan and his regime. And Mr. Verhofstadt, the real problem is not Mr. Weber's claims about the different groups here. The fact is that we have a kind of a group of war rather than a group of democracy. And we are talking while Africa burns, and the flames are looking ever closer to our own homes. Thank you very much.
Mr.
Annemans, how far can the cynicism go? Juncker is congratulating Merkel on the ratings in the polls about the migration policy. We can't cope, and I think that the citizens of Europe now have realised that the Union doesn't take account of people's views and that we've strayed a long way from democracy. Just look at the free trade of goods and persons is misused and abused, and has led to the biggest movement of people in our lifetimes. It's becoming ever clearer that we have occupied, this is a kind of coup d'etat organised by the European Union. Look at the evidence in Portugal, and this is a very clear example, and all that we have is blackmail and force in the field of migration, and everyone has now realised this. Thank you very much. Mr. Papadakis, 1 minute. Thank you, President. This is all very dangerous for the migrants and the citizens of Europe with the mini-summit. It's one thing for the Greek government to say that they've avoided the worst, but the fact is that they have now basically had to set up mass concentration areas for migrants who are basically stuck there in a kind of enclave, and until we get a revision of the Dublin Convention. If they are in the end going to be with returns, what does return mean? It means that people are basically sent back to countries where war is still raging, wars which were in the inception caused by the European countries themselves. And we're now seeing concentrations of forces. We're seeing people being herded like sheep at the non-existing internal borders. Now we've seen we must do things for the refugees and not simply pander to the demands of capitalists and the monopoly forces. Thank you very much. Who's next?
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Lamassoure. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Enough's enough. All of this contradiction, hypocrisy, it's enough now. There's a migratory exodus that has reached our doors, and the first lesson of this is that the Union is incapable of facing up to crisis situations because it all comes down to governance. We can face up to climate change, putting a stop to it by 2040, but when it comes to housing hundreds of thousands of refugees here in Europe, we can't cope. We deal with in a chaotic manner, facing up to a chaotic crisis. Secondly, we've got a financial problem. And once again, hundreds of billions of dollars are promised to cool down the climate over a 20-year period. We're the best at that, but when it comes to just providing additional guards on our borders, the European Union doesn't have the wherewithal. The budget for 2016 will be adopted in a couple of days' time, will be pretty much insufficient. Europe, everybody wants to have people in, but nobody wants to cough up neither the big countries nor the small countries, or the poor countries or the rich countries. Third lesson, the political hypocrisy that we see in all of our countries at all levels and pretty much in all of our groups. There's been an auction of values. Some say that they've got Judeo-Christian roots, others talk about enlightenment and secularism, then there's the call of the proletariat in certain countries, then there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights trotted out, but when it comes to electoral speeches and when people fail to turn up to vote, the defenders of those universal values pretty much demonstrate indifference. Women and children being allowed to freeze and go hungry here simply because they're not us or because they come from somewhere else. The time has come to put Europe back onto its feet. Thank you, President Juncker, for having reminded us of that with your words.
Avem doi colegi care au cerut blue cards.
Thank you. 2 blue cards. We have 2 blue cards, and I would urge you to understand that it's not possible, given the delay and the time pressure we're all under. Mr. Breton and Mr. Frunzulic, do you agree? Thank you very much for that. Now, I realise that it's not fair, but it is a compromise. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Next is Mrs. Sippel for 1 minute.
The European Union is a voluntary association. The members commit to shared sovereignty and shared responsibility. Older and newer member states tend to forget this, however, and they revert to national egoism. We need to ensure that refugees throughout the European Union have better access to legal channels, and you need to look at individual asylum applications. We need to look at reception capabilities. We can only register refugees if in a very short space of time we have redistribution across member states, we have integration, and we look at improving the lot for refugees across all member states. Tax fairness, incidentally, would also be a fundamental issue that we need to address. So national egoism is not the way forward. Member states need to work as one within the European Union.
Doamna Stevens.
Thank you. Mrs. Stevens, 1 minute.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Beste collega's.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, the only result of the mini-summit is that 100,000 extra places are going to be organised along the Balkan route. Is that all? The exodus towards Western Europe, including economic migrants, is continuing and it's going to be better organised than hitherto. The Commission is looking for a short-term fix, and that's why that proposal has been made. Now we're looking at the possibility of pushbacks. They are absolutely possible. They're in conformity with international and European law. What the modalities are, practical arrangements, cannot be properly investigated. In 2015, 500,000 people entered the European Union. Turkey is using these asylum seekers as a bargaining chip for visa liberalisation or possibly accession to the European Union. This in exchange for better monitoring, better surveillance of the EU external frontier. Why? Because the EU cannot or doesn't want to defend its external border. We have a moral duty to stop simply accepting economic migrants by having an open frontier policy. Thank you very much.
Doamna Zuber, 1 minut.
Mrs. Zuber, 1 minute.
Obrigada. Nas últimas reuniões do Conselho da União Europeia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. At the last meeting of the European Council, solidarity came to an end. All the meetings basically have been meetings about how you could organize the removal of migrants from the European Union more efficiently, and this is these are measures taken against those that are undesirable, and we must ensure that illegal migrants are returned, and a legitimate means to do that is arrest. So these people are dealt with as if they were criminals. In the Czech Republic, this particular approach has been criticized. What about EU4Med? What's going on with that? There are thousands of migrants that are turned back by military forces, even attacked, and I think we have to reflect on what really is going on there.
Thank you very much. Eva Joly has 1 minute. Mr. President of Commission, President of the European Council, on the 11th and 12th of November you're going to Valletta for a summit on migration. But let's not kid ourselves. The discussion on economic development and organising legal channels is going to be marginal, or the object of undignified horse trading. We don't have a common approach, and instead the European Union or certain member states are obstinately militarising their frontiers with dubious agreements with authoritarian leaders who are our neighbours. And look at the Khartoum process. Trafficking in migrants will not be solved by subcontracting our borders to others or by launching dangerous military operations against the traffickers. Opening legal channels and secure channels for immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees is important if we had to have a common policy based on solidarity. Thank you very much. Mr. Mach.
Ladies and gentlemen, I heard the Council conclusions and the statements of MEPs in this chamber. The idea that comes to my head is that a big problem for Europe is false humanitarianism. Those of you who supported the breakup of the regimes in Libya and Syria, were you really concerned with the well-being of the people there, or were you rather concerned with ousting evil dictators and showing the world how humane you were? Those of you who opened your arms to migrants and support them generously, are you really interested in their well-being, or do you just want to show the world and yourselves how humane you are? The Council conclusions mention now that they want to reinforce external borders, but they were your MEPs who voted on the criticism about guarding the external borders in the first place, and I think this is a very cheap trick that the European Parliament should criticize protection measures at our external borders. I really think that false humanitarianism is a big problem for us. Thank you.
Mr. Wilimski, 1 minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, the great migration of people from the African continent to Europe is one of those few examples of where you've got a real international need for a community of states, and you need to provide protection for people who need it in the region, and you'll need to create safe zones in the region as well, and this would be the responsibility of a strong community, but the European Union is doing the exact opposite. It seems that those making decisions in the European Union are running around a farmyard clucking rather than actually making decisions, and the whole thing has given rise to chaos, and Chancellor Merkel has made certain statements about Arabia and other places, saying you're all welcome. Then the Austrian Chancellor Faymann as well. They're both culpable, and those that do proper policy know that their responsibilities lie quite elsewhere, and that people need to be dealt with where they come from rather than having this migration.
Mr. González Pons, 2 minutes.
President, we are very slow in tackling a crisis of humanitarian proportions. The refugee crisis is becoming a real institutional crisis. Member states are not implementing the measures proposed by the Commission. We are not working on a common asylum and refugee policy. We're not tackling the root causes of war. We are setting up new internal borders rather than securing our external borders. We are hoping that other countries will resolve our problems at any cost, and we are tossing blame back and forth for what is being done or not being done elsewhere. We have to wonder, is it because the European Union doesn't realize or cannot resolve the problem? Why are we being so slow in tackling the problems to hand? And this slowness is really fostering Euroscepticism and xenophobia. The refugee crisis started off as a humanitarian crisis. Now it is becoming a true political crisis. What is the European Union seeking to achieve? Is it not to have more refugees come here, but at the same time not want to get involved in tackling the root causes of the wars that these refugees are fleeing? Until we have got to the bottom of this, until we have understood that the war triggering the flow of refugees, until we've understood that the war in Syria is also a war on Europe, until we've understood that, we will not be able to resolve the refugee crisis and the problems facing Europe. The refugees and Europeans, we are fighting the same war, and that's what we need to understand.
Mr. Weidenholzer, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm delighted that we have this initiative from the Commission, and it needs our support. I was in Gevgelia, Preševo and Passau on the Balkan route many times last week, and I've seen desperate and exhausted people, a lot of running around, a huge speed that people need to achieve if 10,000 people are going to cross the border. It looks like an exodus, and I think therefore we need to try and calm things down. We need to calm down, slow down this development, and it's a question of providing aid in the countries of origin in such a way that we can then manage the hotspots on our borders and do it in a way that is in conformity with humanitarian requirements.
Mulțumim. Thank you very much. Next, Mr. Škripek for 1 minute.
Mr. President, one of the priorities in this crisis is the protection of external border. An example of effective cooperation in this area could be the joint posting of enforcement units in Hungary that is carried out by V4. Hungary plays a key role in this aspect, but let's be honest, the financial support to Turkey was supposed to arrive far earlier. European Union cannot step back from its basic values while formulating the agreement with Turkey. Turkey is asking for accelerated accession process, but it's not allowed to us to somehow bargain with the rules and conditions that every candidate state had to meet. Recently, German Chancellor Merkel has proposed so-called privileged partnership to Turkey and not the accession to Turkey as such. Now we are under pressure and changing the approach. We have to stop migration flows, but we are not modifying our rational approach. The media freedom and any other things are a testimony of a country's ability to fulfill these criteria.
For 1 minute. This is Sakura for 1 minute. Thank you very much. President, I just wonder how long the Commission and Council will be able to carry on debating how they're going to tackle the crisis, the humanitarian crisis. We are seeing these pictures unfolding on our screens, and then we get the mini summit on Sunday, and it's really an insult to the millions of refugees, the thousands of people who've died, and also it's a sad day for European civilization. Germany is now seeking to turn the south, and in particular Greece, into a huge concentration camp, and encouraging the creation of closed frontiers within the European Union. This is a dangerous game of destabilisation with Turkey. It destabilises the whole enlargement policy and also the Greek sovereign rights. You are being blind if you don't realise that we're currently seeing is the shaky foundations of Europe being exposed for all to see. It's not a question of what Europe do we want. If we're not careful, there will be no Europe, thank you, for any of us.
On 1 minute.
Thank you, Mrs. Atkinson. 1 minute.
The left in Mr PITTELLA today reached a new low in this House by calling us a virus. Then we have Mr Schulz, who seems to think it's wrong to protect national interests. I was actually sent here to protect our national interests, and actually the people of Britain will vote to leave this place because they recognise that our national interests are not being served in this place. And Mr Juncker, when in doubt, have a summit. Of course we must have a summit. And the man from Luxembourg comes along too. Now, it's great that the man from Luxembourg comes along to talk about migration, but nobody, not one single migrant, is banging on the door to get into Luxembourg. I go to Calais quite a lot, and now the number of migrants in Calais trying to get into the UK has doubled to 6,000. I said it before, the majority of these people are not refugees, they are economic migrants.
Apparently there is no translation in French.
Well, it doesn't matter.
We're missing the French language translation.
As I said it before, the people are not refugees, they are economic migrants. The main concern of the migrants is not safety, but economic gain. And in Calais, the people storming the tunnel, the majority of which are aggressive young men. I was on Eurostar yesterday, and when I entered France, there was a number of migrants sitting on the tracks on this side. The police didn't detain them, they didn't deport them, and that's wrong. And that's why this place is going to crumble.
Mulțumim. Domnul Brok are un blue card pentru dumneavoastră.
Well, no.
Mr. Brok has a blue card.
It's anymore, so no, please carry on. We've got votes to do.
I never expected anything else from you. Thank you very much. Mr. Brok, the dialogue has been, Mr. Brok, the dialogue has been between our distinguished colleague and the British electorate, so we don't get into it. Thank you very much. Doamna Gardini, 2 minute.
Mrs. Gardini, 2 minutes.
Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. As an Italian person, can I just say that Italy has been a little bit overshadowed in this debate. And can I say that we are seeing only small skirmishes compared to the huge humanitarian problems others have mentioned today. And I'm impressed by what President Juncker said, when he said that our resources are not unlimited, they are finite. And I believe that our solidarity must not be finite or limited either. We must look at this in a spirit of urgency. This is an emergency. And we have got to deploy everything which we've promised. However, solidarity without limits is not something we can find either, because that's not serious, it's not responsible, and we're going to deal a major blow to Europe itself. This is only one step, the immediate emergency, but there is a geopolitical dimension. Look at the roots, look at where people are coming from. We've got to stabilise the home countries and work towards the end whereby migrants are in a position to live in their countries of origin, their place of origin. We have got to provide assistance and stability and to prevent the systematic evacuation of huge areas with the risk of desertification. That's bad for the climate, but also because of the culture, which has not been mentioned so far. And let me just say, a great Italian, Pier Paolo Pasolini, in the 60s, he was prophetic when he talked about the blue eyes. We're going to see people flowing in and rowing in. They're going to come in their millions. They're going to land in Crotone in their millions, in their rags and tatters. And that was a great Italian in the 60s, and it does seem like a description of what is now happening, and the problem itself has clearly not gone away. Thank you.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Niedermüller.
Köszönöm, elnök úr. A nyugat-balkáni útvonal.
Thank you, President. The 17 points about the West Balkans route is an important result. This shows that a common Europe built on solidarity can be successful despite difficulties. On the other hand, a policy built on selfishness and fences is doomed to failure. Only the first steps were taken on Sunday, and I don't mean border operations. We need to do more for the fast integration of refugees. What we need is integration and not forced assimilation. We need to teach these people languages, and for that we need a lot of money. Let's not create an atmosphere of fear. Let's build an integration policy together. As long as the EU does not have a common integration policy, we can't achieve results. Thank you.
Mulțumim. Doamna Gal, 2 minute.
Mrs. Gal, 2 minutes.
Mr. President, honorable colleagues, this migration crisis has become a standard item on our agenda. At the same time, there's more and more pressure on Europe, and we are still undecided about what to do. We need innovative solutions and responsible action. To be able to show our solidarity in actions, in deeds, to be really able to help the people in need, we have to put an end to the policy of open borders and welcome to all. We have to speak clearly, and we have to be honest about what we're going to do. This summit showed that unless we identify the most urgent short and medium term actions, and then we cannot manage the situation anymore. Today, the Balkans route is a good example of that, but it's going to become even worse and worse. It was high time to really admit the problems that have been around since August. The Hungarian Prime Minister has been named and shamed when he said that the protection of external borders must be a priority. We have to make a distinction between asylum seekers and economic migrants. And we have the latter, we have to return, we have to register all the entrants. We cannot move them from one border to the other, and the migrants cannot really pick and choose where they want to apply for asylum. We cannot solve the problem inside Europe unless we protect our external borders, and unless we are able to tell people, yes, you can come, but only so many of you. The Schengen system can only be protected this way, which is one of the greatest achievements of Europe. We have to have the people in the camps, in the refugee camps, where there are millions of them waiting to return home to their home country. We need responsible action. That's what people want. That's what people expect. And the EPP Madrid conference pointed this out.
Mi-aduc aminte apropo de rut.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Gal. I recall the fact that we have a timetable. It was used by those that attacked Vienna at the end of the 1600s. Mrs. Garcia.
Thank you, President. Rapid, urgent, immediate. I do wonder the meaning of those adjectives for some present in this chamber. We are aware of the hypocrisy. We hear people talk about solidarity from some MEPs. MEPs whose governments are doing a very poor job of managing this crisis. A month ago, we decided on distribution of quotas for refugees. Then yesterday, Mr. Rajoy, to give you an example, announced that civil servants would be involved in a project and the first 50 refugees would be taken in. Is this a joke? Mr. Orban's image in the EPP in Madrid. He was applauded when he attended the Congress in Madrid, despite his statements against refugees and immigration. Let's not kid ourselves. We're playing with the lives of hundreds of thousands of refugees here.
Thank you, Mrs. Suica.
As a Croatian, I'm worried about the situation and how to reconcile all the national egoism and the European cohesion mentioned by Mr. Tusk this morning. It is good that we've had a meeting on Sunday where all the heads of the Balkan countries were present, and I'm sorry Mr. Juncker is not here, but it is not a wonder that these heads of countries could not organize a meeting on their own, because the situation exceeds the capacities of the Western Balkan countries, and it is good that the meeting has been organized by the institutions. I agree that instead of the internal borders, we should safeguard the external borders. I agree with Mr. Gonzalez as well, who said that war against Syria is war against the EU, and until we resolve the problems at the origin, we will not be able to deal with the migration issue. I also support the action plan. We need to support Turkey because otherwise we will not be able to handle this situation. A chaos may ensue, the winter is upcoming, and if we do not start implementing the decisions adopted, the member states will not be able to do things on their own. They need to implement the decisions, otherwise we will have chaos. And as politicians, we have a task, a duty, and citizens expect of us to deal with problems. So I ask everybody to become serious, to understand the gravity of the possibility of the destabilization of the European project.
Domnul Moraes, un minut.
Thank you, Mr. Moraes. 1 minute.
President, we should indeed understand the gravity of the situation, and it's important that whatever our political views, we don't give up on the European Union for a well-organised and compassionate response. It's the reason why Commissioner Avramopoulos and the Budget Commissioner will meet with us in a few minutes after the votes, because we have to do something. We have to take action. It's right that the Commission convened the West Balkan Summit. They did it with a lot of criticism, but the chaos has to be resolved, and people are suffering up to winter. We will see more deaths, and this Parliament will call for action. So action has to be taken, and that means that this Parliament must do its work. After all, the talk is finished. We will have to do the work. We will have to get the financial instruments. We will have to ensure that the hotspots work. My interest, Commissioner, is to ensure that those hotspots and reception centres work. They would have worked if the asylum conditions had been created over the past years and Member States had done it then. So we have to do it now. We have to get on with it, and we have to make it work in the next few weeks.
Mulțumim. Mulțumim. Domnul Kefaloianis.
Thank you. Mr. Kefaloianis, 1 1/2.
Thank you, President. At the European Summit, this was a big meeting, and it was important because steps were taken to accommodate large numbers of people across the Western Balkan route, all the way from Germany through the Balkans up to Germany and Austria. And for Greece, Greece accepted. It accepted certain things. And it accepted, for example, an extra 50,000 refugees, and agreed on the creation of hotspots for the registration and processing of these refugees. And in future there will be people who receive payments to help them with their rent. Now, what was lacking, what was missing from the conclusions is Turkey. We need a the joint action programme with Turkey. It must be far away from Levantine horse trading. We didn't have an agreement with the Balkan countries. It's important that President Tusk, President Juncker announced that well, we know that they're going to go to Valletta and that efforts are being made. But what we didn't see either in the conclusions was that only Lebanon and Jordan among the Arab countries have done anything. The richer countries in the Arab world have not. In Saudi Arabia, for example, they would be able to do far more. And we must ask, is everyone doing all that they can? And we should be bringing pressure to bear to make sure they do. Thank you very much.
Mrs. Perez, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, President of Council, Commissioner. Europe, in what everybody's calling a crisis, is looking like it's being subjugated rather than managing this crisis. Who's really interested in the situation in Syria? Who's saying that in the face of this flow of refugees, it's because Daesh is making progress in Syria? who's saying that we can find a solution with Assad and that we are not managing to work out how to agree on all of this with Russia. Well, Commissioner, say to the President of the Commission that he must act, because otherwise there will only be interdependencies between all of us rather than solidarity. And it's exactly in the same way as we built the Economic and Monetary Union without an economic pillar. We're doing Schengen without a European office for the protection of refugees and asylum seekers, without a migration policy, without external protection of our borders. And I would call on the President of the Commission to make sure that the work is de-siloized and start taking strong initiatives, not just to point the finger at the Council for its responsibilities, but to give Europe back its voice in this matter.
De Lange, 1 minut și 30 de secunde.
Mrs. De Lange, 1.5 minutes.
Wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, President. The debate, I think, is holding up a mirror to the European Parliament. If we can't see the masses of people, then I think that we're losing sight of the European values that we're supposed to uphold. These are people who need us, who require our protection. They're looking for solidarity, and we must show solidarity to the countries which are bearing the brunt. And we need clarity, and in all honesty, that we'll be seeing, you don't need our protection, and we're going to organise an orderly return. But that's going to cost a lot of money, and the member states simply make pledges, then they don't deliver, and because they hope it's going to be done for them, free, gratis and for nothing. Now, there has been a lot of humanitarian sentiment here, but of course it does put us under pressure if we are unable to physically engage in surveillance of our external borders. At that point we need to get a European Coast Guard. Of course we need to cooperate with neighbouring countries. I don't think that you should have a linkage between accession, for example, with Turkey and help with the migrants. Let's not have that kind of linkage. But let's do things in a way which is sincere, honest and out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Daly, 1 minute.
Grazie, Chair.
Thank you, Chair, Commissioner. The Balkan summits clearly highlighted the tensions existing currently within the EU, in a moment when, ideally, the European Union is united and is speaking with one voice. The Valletta summit, to be held in a few days' time, offers a golden opportunity for the EU to embark on a constructive discussion with the African Union, which should lead to concrete results. Immigration flows are happening because of wars, instability, poverty, lack of employment and breaches of fundamental human rights that are still widespread in certain African and Arab countries. The EU needs to make sure that the aid it provides results in concrete changes. We need to be strong when we request that these leaders put their citizens in the center of their policies. At this point in time, we need the European Union to speak with one strong voice if we truly want to tackle the situation in such a way that it leads to real change.
Mulțumim, domnul Rangel, 1 minut.
Thank you. Mr. Rangel, 1.5 minutes.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Presidente.
Thank you, President. Looking at the summit conclusions and the leaders' meeting at the weekend, it is clear that two principles must be made crystal clear. We are dealing with Europe's responsibility here, the responsibility of all member states. We need to all contribute towards the financial effort required. We must help those member states of transit for refugees fleeing war in their home countries. We must also, however, apply criteria. We should not conflate economic migrants with refugees. We need a clear distinction when it comes to registration and reception. conditions and centres. We also need to work with front-line countries, whether they belong to the European Union or not. That is the responsibility incumbent upon us, and all EU member states need to do their bit. Another point, it is important that at some stage we take preventive action, in particular in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. That is very important. That is something that we cannot delay on.
This is Mitzi, 1 minute.
Microphone. Yeah, now it works.
President.
President, migration is a symptom, not a cause, and unless we address the root causes of this problem, it can only get worse. Economic, social and political instability, coupled with war, violation of human rights, terrorist attacks, and are among some of the reasons that have caused these symptoms. The Member States, the African Union, the UN and others will be given a one-off opportunity during the Valletta Summit to cooperate and work towards coming up with an international and genuine solution to this migration crisis, which can only happen if attention is focused on the fundamental causes of migration. I therefore urge Member States to use the EU-African Summit in my country, Malta, as a platform to develop strategies that react to the human, social and political challenges that sadly are forcing people to flee their homes, which has led to this exodus from Africa to Europe. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. Yet I appeal to all the participants to focus on how to offer these persons a future in the country so as not to force them to set off and risk their lives in trying to find a dignified future in other countries. It is a big challenge and we need long-term strategies, but if we not begin now post-haste, this problem will remain with us forever.
President, on behalf of British Labour MEPs, I welcome any cooperation with Turkey and other countries that can help better manage the current crisis. You'll have heard the cynical voices from some in this House, but they will never seek solutions. Instead, they will only seek to use this tragic situation for political gain. Now, national leaders who have reached this deal must take on their responsibilities to deliver their own agreement. This crisis is a continuing nightmare for all those families forced to walk mile upon mile to reach shelter and food for their children. These are people just like us. They are human beings. It isn't a political game. Talking of which, I note that at the Council meeting there was a short discussion on the terms of the UK's negotiations and referendum, so I will use this opportunity to warn Prime Minister Cameron there can be no more delay. This is too important. He needs now to join us in securing a future that Britain deserves, a future inside the European Union.
Doamna Piri, 1 minute.
Mrs. Piri, 1 minute.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Let me use this opportunity to thank the European Commission for its commitment to find practical solutions to this huge challenge we are all facing. I welcome the action plan that was developed jointly with Turkey, as Turkey and the EU need each other to share the burden of providing safe havens for so many people fleeing war. So we urgently need to discuss further about financial support, resettlement, the effective return of economic migrants and fighting smugglers. I nevertheless do reject the linkage of cooperation on the refugees to the EU accession process, as these issues are unrelated. Postponing the progress report on Turkey without any explanation gives the impression that the EU is avoiding being critical on the human rights situation ahead of important elections. That gives a totally wrong signal. The EU should not stop expressing its concerns on the freedom of the press or the situation of the Kurdish minority. Thank you.
Mulțumim. Doamna Toia, 1 minut.
Mrs. Toia, 1 minute.
Thank you. Just picking up where President Juncker left off, he talked about the problems of the ones are the problems of the other. And that's the rule of any community such as ours. It also applies to institutions. Europe will stay on its feet only if it meets that, upholds the dictate, the imperative of solidarity. Because if it's not these people, there will be someone else coming. For too long, individual countries have been left to their own devices. Slovenia, Greece, other countries. And people are now trudging through the Balkans, but it's the same ones who were in the blistering heat of under the blistering sun of the Mediterranean for months as well. President Juncker, we need a guide. The Commission must do everything it must do, step by step, action by action, in order to come up with tangible results, practical results. We need a proper vision of the situation. My group chair, Mr. Pittella, said we need a paradigm shift. We've got to see Africa in a different way, and everyone's got to share the responsibility, and we cannot see rounds of destabilization and then this happening afterwards. Thank you.
I come from Croatia, and we've had over 250,000 immigrants arriving to Croatia. They've all been given health care and transportation without any type of militarization of the borders. Statements about intentionally driving people into rivers are completely not in touch with the truth. The Sunday Agreement is good in its basis, but how will it function if we have another 10,000 of people arriving towards Croatia a day, and we have a country on the route that will limit to 2,500 people? So we cannot limit this issue to the Balkans, nor resolve this until we have the external borders under control. Instead of finger-pointing, let us turn to cooperation. The European Union needs to find a sustainable long-term solution to the problem. Otherwise, we cannot expect from the exposed countries to put their own security at the second place in front of the waves of the migrants. Thank you.
Domnul Kirkos, 1 minute.
Mr. Kirkos, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yesterday we were given the 19-point conclusions, which is very good provided it's put into effect and implemented. Those are no doubt solutions in terms of solidarity so that we can stop this burgeoning of xenophobia. However, we need a lasting approach. Otherwise, the flow is going to continue, and the hotspots are simply going to morph into prisons. Now, we can talk with the Turks, and we can have legal channels, but the fact is that unless we solve the basic problem, we're not going to make real progress longer term. In a small island like Tilos, which has got a very small population, these people are completely overwhelmed, and yet they are trying very hard to organize themselves and show practical solidarity at the granular level. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move on to the Catch the Eye procedure. I will give the floor to 7 speakers. We have countless requests and cannot accept all. First of all, Mrs. Mosenberg.
Thank you, President. At the mini-summit on Sunday, one decision was that between now and the end of the year, 30,000 people would be looked after in Greece. That's between now and the end of the year, 30,000 people. Already we've got unemployment. Already we've got problems providing for the basic needs of our population. And that decision basically runs counter to the relocation, which was decided only in October. A serious approach to the problem means responsible talks with the major transit country, which is Turkey. And also we have to have proper surveillance of the illegal trafficking networks who are bringing people to Europe. If we don't do that, then this is going to be simply a time bomb at the fundament of Europe. Thank you very much.
Mrs. Gomez.
first of all, stop the nonsense about the coup d'etat in Portugal. I noted that Mr. Weber said that he was concerned about the prospect of a fully democratically based left coalition in my country as a result of the elections. He doesn't worry, apparently, about the prospect of a xenophobic, anti-European, extreme right-wing government in Poland. But at least in Portugal, we are ready to receive refugees. That has been stated by all authorities and entities involved in the reception. But the fact is that the relocation process is not working at the European level. They are not coming. I hope that at least in the Valletta summit, this will be an opportunity for our leaders to realize what they have been told here in this parliament, is that without opening safe and legal avenues for refugees and migrants, they will continue to feed business into the criminal gangs, and without indeed working strategically to end the conflicts in Syria and Libya and to defeat terrorists of ISIS in Iraq and Turkey, the EU will not be addressing the root causes why refugees have to flee, and they will keep coming. And this is not a refugee crisis. It's a truly European crisis because we are failing our duties to protect those in need.
Thank you, Mrs. Gomez. Mr. Rados.
Thank you, President. I welcome the agreement reached on Sunday. It will enable refugees to suffer less and will help the countries that are on their route, among other countries, my country, Croatia, through which more than 200,000 refugees have passed recently. But it is impossible to prevent refugees to come to the European Union. That would not be possible without actively using force, and I do hope that the European Union will not opt for that solution. A good solution would be a deal with Turkey, and to have a long-term solution is to influence the solutions of the crisis in the Middle East and in Northern Africa. But unfortunately, the European Union doesn't even plan that.
Mr. Hadjigeorgiou.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This has been a 3-hour discussion, a 3-hour debate, more or less. And I must say that if I was a refugee or a migrant and I'd been listening in, then I must say that I'd be looking for I'd jump in the Aegean and kill myself. Looking at the rhetoric here, talking about protecting the refugees' rights, and President Juncker, who I think did not give any tangible proposal for a short-term solution to the problem. We've heard about cooperation with our neighbours, but for us to say, with Turkey, to say that they are a safe country, after the bomb attack, the recent bomb attack, and the many dead and injured, with their bombarding of the Kurds, with the hecatomb of people who died in Ankara itself, and suggesting that we can simply get it out of our backyard into theirs, I think is a bit much.
Thank you. Mr. Maragall. Thank you, President. Presidents Tusk and Juncker have set out the facts. The European Union is lacking in political terms. We are shocked by what is happening along the Balkans routes, and we've heard statements here in this chamber. But the real scandal is not taking place along the Balkans route, but rather in Western Europe, in the European Union. The European Union is failing. It's not a European Union of the 28, but rather of the 15. We are seeing really focus on borders. That's only a small percentage of the problem. Is Europe stupid? Are we truly acting as Europeans? We are talking about border guards and camps in France, Germany, Sweden, the UK. We need to see responsibility within the European Union. Thank you, President. Thank you, Mr. Obermayr.
Schlagworte ohne.
Thank you very much, President. Hotspots, common border guarding, these are all the slogans. The fact is that we've missed a beat. Schengen has failed, we're not protecting the external frontiers, we've lost people's trust and confidence in us. We are impinging on national sovereignty. If millions of refugees can come into the Balkans and the rest of Europe, these are mainly young people, young men, looking for the promised land, be that Germany, Austria, Sweden and all the rest of it. It's no surprise either. When you look at the differentials, the different income levels, either in Afghanistan or in Syria, but fine words are not going to solve the problem. We've got to do something tangible and practical. Thank you.
Herr Kukan.
Thank you. Mr. Kukan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Since the beginning of the migration crisis, I was appealing to the EU leaders to include the Western Balkan countries in its solution. These countries are directly affected by flow of refugees and migrants passing through Balkan road. In order to solve this crisis, we need to find the mode of tighter cooperation with them. We also need to be careful to prevent the creation of other crises in this region. The financial support has been so far limited and our response came quite late. I am glad that the summit on Sunday tackled these issues. I welcome the basic plan and concrete actions instead of building walls. In order to manage the migration flow, we must cooperate closely on border management, fight with human trafficking, information sharing and help in providing the necessary humanitarian assistance. I think managing this crisis together is also a chance to better prepare these countries for future eventual EU membership. Thank you.
Mrs. Benova.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne, pán predseda.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's not very pleasant to speak at this moment, but nonetheless, I thank you for the floor. I'd like to appreciate the position of the Commission when it comes to looking for a solution to this refugee crisis. I believe we should perhaps criticize the position of some member states who were not prepared to try and solve the crisis. I'd like to also mention, Mr. Commissioner, one particular topic that has to do directly with the refugee crisis, and that is the increase of extremism, radicalism and fascism in the member states of the EU. We are starting to witness not only mass demonstrations of these radicals and extremists, but repeated attacks on the facilities where these refugees are being housed and where are offering them help. Therefore, I'd like to appeal to the member states, not to us, to the Parliament, to the Commission, but to the member states themselves to show a lot more initiative in fighting the forms of extremism and nationalism in their own countries. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would appreciate it if you could take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps those few colleagues involved in private conversations could take their seats. With the best will in the world, I cannot imagine that anybody has been listening to the last 10 speakers. Now, in parliamentary debate, the assumption is that colleagues speak and other MEPs listen to them. I don't think that was the case for the last 10 speakers, and I think that is unfair. Commissioner Avramopoulos now has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Honourable members of the Parliament, today President Juncker gave a strong message on the Commission's actions and support in order to address the refugee crisis. We are committed. I noticed here today a strong support from you, almost from all of you, to our initiatives. We really need this support from the European Parliament. And what we have achieved so far is thanks to this support. We need it also from different states, inside and outside the European Union, and we have to help them as well. Sunday's mini-summit, as it was called, meeting, is positive, as states along the route, along the Balkans route, came at the same table, around the table, and the dialogue now is open. But several used their own national narrative. I have to admit, there is still not a full European spirit of cooperation. More cooperation, more solidarity, more responsibility are needed. And now, we need actions, not only commitments. It's now. Implementation is key. This is also the message I got from you here. Implement and do even more on borders management, on protection of asylum seekers in an organised way, and on cooperation within countries outside Europe. The role of the Commission has changed with this crisis. Constant monitoring, dialogue and support is needed, and initiatives in a more strategic way and scope. This is also why the Commission work programme will have to give some answers in relation to borders, Dublin, resettlement, legal migration and relocation, already on the table. They are all keys. Because we cannot afford to fail. Let's not forget that the refugee crisis is used in multiple ways in the internal national debates, public opinion. Only solution: to explain to our citizens, to explain to people the need for a common approach at different levels, and to demonstrate the supportive role of the Commission to Member States and affected neighbouring countries. I am fully committed and ready to cooperate with you and the different countries directly or indirectly involved European, African, Asian countries, including on our policy on returns. I had planned to go tomorrow to Pakistan, but because of the terrible earthquake I had to postpone it for next week. But I will go there and discuss with the Pakistani authorities on the readmission policy and their commitments on that. Members of the Parliament, the refugee crisis is a catalyst for more Europe. It is a crash test for Europe. It is a test of credibility of our principles and the capability of our institutions. And this is what the Commission is doing, by having put migration on the top of its priorities from the very first day. By taking the necessary initiatives like the Balkan Route Summit last Sunday, by standing by the Member States in need, in order to give value and substantial content to the principles of solidarity and responsibility, and by enhancing the unity of the Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. We will now hear from the Council President, Donald Tusk.
Thank you, Mr. President. Of course, I share the concerns of this Chamber. The realization of the decisions undertaken during this crisis is not going as quickly as it is necessary. This is the time that the regular procedures in all the Member States should be replaced by emergency procedures. The awareness of this fact is not dominant, unfortunately, in all the Member States. I am convinced that this will happen, and I would like to assure you that the Luxembourg presidency is ready to support the efforts of the Commission in acquiring human and financial resources indispensable in tackling this crisis. But let us also be fair. Contributions to the World Food Programme, UNHCR and other agencies exceed what has been pledged so far. And this is not the easiest time for the governments to spend fresh money today, as you can imagine. It's maybe the most difficult one. And let us remember, when it comes to relocation, that today there are 8 times more places prepared for refugees to be relocated than the refugees who want to make use of them. But what is maybe most importantly, we are still working on the common view when it comes to the method and the purpose of protecting external borders. From the beginning of this crisis, I have underlined that our clear aim should be a significant containment of the migration tide. But the opinion that it is impossible and that Europe should accept nearly all who want to come here is still being voiced. There have also been comments about treating refugees in some Member States by the police. We heard accusations that human rights have been violated. I want to state very firmly that human rights are threatened mainly then when the law is not enforced. Those people are fleeing countries where there are no police and administration at all. The condition for respecting human rights is the protection of the legal order and the enforcement of rules. In fact, this general remark refers to all these issues we are discussing here in the context of the migratory crisis. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Tusk. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of debate on this item.
Comes to the vote. The first item is Mr. Dartmouth. You have a point of order. I give the floor.
I have a point of order.
Yes, I am.
Madam Chair, is it in order to congratulate Mr. Donald Tusk in his skillful decision to resign as Prime Minister of Poland last year in order to take up the job of President of the Council at 5 times the salary?
Mr. Dartmouth, this is not point of order. So, we move on to the report by Mr. Sikorski by roll call vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. Adopted. We move on to the next item, report by Mr. Kofod by roll call vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. Also adopted. Next item is, congratulations. Next item is report by Mr. Scott Cato by roll call vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. Also adopted. Next item is report by Mrs. Flašíková-Beňová by roll call vote. The vote is open. The vote is open. Okay. Vote is closed. Adopted. Next item is also report by Mrs. Flašíková-Beňová by roll call vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. Also adopted. Next item is also report by Mrs. Flašíková-Beňová by roll call vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. Also adopted. Congratulations. Next item is report by Mrs. Colin Langen. We vote on Amendment 1 by roll call vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. Rejected. The Council position, which reflects an agreement with Parliament, has been approved and the Act has been adopted. Next item is a report by the Castillo Vera. We vote on Amendment 1 by roll call vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. Rejected. Next vote is Amendment 8 and 19 together by roll call vote. The vote is open. Vote is closed. Rejected. Vote on Amendment 9 and 20 together by roll call vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. Rejected. Vote on Amendment 10 and 21 by roll call vote. The vote is open. Vote is closed. Rejected. Vote on Amendment 11 and 22 by roll call vote. The vote is open. Vote is closed. Rejected. Vote on Amendment 12 and 23 together by roll call vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. Also rejected. Vote on Amendment 13 and 24 by roll call vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. Rejected. Vote on Amendment 2 by roll call vote. The vote is open. Vote is closed. Also rejected. Vote on Amendments 3 and 14 by roll call vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. Rejected. Vote on Amendment 4 and 15 by